Hey guys, I guess I'm live. I just wanted to hang out, kind of, because it's the weekend and this is what I do on weekends. I work on paintings. So I'm just getting through these little Orca whale paintings. I thought maybe, actually, I'll move this up. This is another little sketch that I have. These are a wood panel, and I've basically just created a ground with acrylic paint and gesso, and I just mixed them in here so I have them to reuse across series. And so I have a little sketch. This one's more under the water with some islands above water, and we can see through the top. I love doing these ones, they're so much fun. And then this one is more like we're above the water and then the whales are kind of swimming, and I really love painting those wakes around the whales as the water separates. So I don't know, I just thought I could do a couple more paintings before the end of the year. I'm using oil paint. To be honest, I use it pretty much straight out of the tube. I have a little bit of safflower oil here if it's not moving well enough. And then the other thing I really like that I'll use later is a blending and glazing medium. And that's just for the end if I need to sort of color adjust and stuff. But for the most part, I really like to just kind of do like one and done on my paintings. So yeah, I'm just taking like a little flat brush. This is actually a really cheap brush. These are the Zens. They're like $5.99 each, but I really like flat brushes to work with. And so I've already started kind of coming in and fleshing out some of my values and my color. I'm using a really limited palette on this one with, let me see, I've got ultramarine blue, phthalo blue, I believe it's red shade, and I still find it really green. I've got a cadmium red medium, a cadmium yellow and yellow ochre, titanium white, and black. And that's pretty much all I'll need for this one. And in my ground color that you see is a little bit darker than I normally mix them. But I have black. I think I have some Mars black in there just because that's what I found immediately. Sometimes I use ivory black. And then I've also got some, let me see, the phthalo blue and some gesso. And that gives me my ground color. And so I'm just working from the back of the painting toward the front of the painting, and pretty much just mixing little piles of color from dark to light, warm to cool across my palette. I like to mix as I go. I know some people kind of mix up huge amounts of paint and then they paint that way. It's just never been my vibe. It's probably smarter, actually. I find I waste more time in mixing paint than actually painting. So if you're trying to be a bit more efficient, definitely pre-mixing. Because I worked in oil for so many years and it dries so quickly, I just got in the habit of mixing as I went, just to sort of conserve paint. Though I will say stay wet palettes really help. So I'm just working from my little references that I've made for myself here. And I just keep it open on my computer screen. Sometimes if I'm like stuck on a color, I will just sort of use my selection tool in Photoshop to color select to give me an idea. But because this palette is so minimalist, and I'm just kind of, I don't really copy my references verbatim, to be honest. So I'm just going to try to make the colors work across this painting more than copying any kind of reference or color scheme. As you've probably noticed if you've been following me for a while, I've been moving away from pure realism, so I kind of do like to take quite a few liberties with my colors and my shapes and all that kind of stuff. So, but yeah, if you guys have questions about oil painting, please feel free to drop them in. I would be happy to answer any questions. Like I said, I work really minimalist with my oils. Partly because it's just easier for me, kind of one and done sort of scenario. I do sometimes go back in and glaze things if I need to push some saturation or add some shadows and just kind of adjust lighting. but the closer I can get it to being finished with just my initial strokes, the happier I am. And it's partly because when you start mixing all kinds of things into your oil paints, that's when you can sort of run into some issues down the road with things kind of not adhering or sort of falling apart. So I do like to stay as minimalist as possible with my oil paint. It's also just easier. Oil painting can be a lot less intimidating and complicated than people give it credit for. I find it easy because I can sort of do it in a sitting, and I don't have to keep going black and blending, and my colors don't darken as they dry like in acrylic, and there's just all kinds of fun little advantages. I'm working small on wood panels on this one because I want to be able to scan them and turn them into prints. So these are like, I have a hard time holding on to these paintings. I've got a bunch of requests already coming in for them, and I did promise some more in January to some of my collectors. So I wanted to sort of start working on these while I have a few days off over Christmas. And then, yeah, because they have become sort of so popular, I wanted to also be able to offer some prints, and I've just found that getting images of larger paintings quite difficult. They're not easy to photograph. It's really expensive to scan paintings. If large paintings, you have to go to specialty shops with specialty scanners. Also, when you're scanning, it does pick up the texture of the canvas in the scan. And then you're also then printing that sort of visual noise. So I don't know, I just kind of thought this might be easier. So I'm working on a smooth wood panel so that when I do scan it, there's much less texture. The surface is a lot more smooth. It'll be easier for me to get a clear scan. And because they're small, I can just go to my local UPS store. He's on Commercial Street in Vancouver. I love the guy. His name is Manpaul. And he has an 11 by 17 scanner. So I can, this is a 10 by 10. So I can easily fit that on his scanner and get a really high resolution scan. So that will be my plan. All right, so what's happening here is we've got, this is where it's going to get tricky. So I'm probably going to glaze underneath these whales because I want the transparency. So I'm going to kind of like draw some rocks and things along the bottom. And then I'm going to go over with some thin glazes just to drop them back and give them a really rich color, because what's happening in the water right now is it's reflecting light from above. So I can go a little bit more opaque, but I have to get a little bit more tricky underneath. There's a few things that I learned from working with the transparency of acrylics and acrylic glazing that I have applied to oil paints that make some pretty interesting effects. And I can't really use gel mediums like you can in oil and acrylic paint for those effects, but you can kind of fake them with just some sort of thinner glazing mediums. Glazing is really like an old master's tool bag trick. I used to do a lot more of it when I was in university, and then I switched to acrylic and kind of forgot how to glaze in oil for a while. It was weird. It doesn't work the same way. I find acrylics really powerful for glazing. I like to just work back to front. Partly I like to establish my sky first, only because it kind of informs the color temperature of the rest of the painting, and it just kind of gets it out of the way for me. And then, yeah, so I start at the back, but also, especially with oil, because I'm working this way, I don't want to like paint something in the bottom and then just run my hand over it. And I've done that several times in the past. I'll go a little bit more saturated as I come forward, and a little bit higher in value. I like to try to keep sort of clean shapes with my work. Especially on water. I like to sort of abstract my water a little bit. Some of the shape language that I've kind of borrowed or stolen even, I don't know if it's stolen, it's just nodding in the direction of Canadian First Nations work. And I'm not trying to copy their work exactly, but I highly respect our First Nations communities. And so I kind of, in Canadian art, feel like having a very subtle nod in the shape language is what I can do to just say, I see you. And so it won't look anything like First Nations artwork when I'm finished. But the way that I abstract some of my edges, very subtle nod. Chattered water in here. If ever I need a bit of oil, I just grab a little bit. It just helps the paint move a little bit better, but I do like to keep it to a minimum. And I feel like this is going to get really green, but I do feel like the ground needs to be a little more green. I love it. Paintings on Instagram, because everything's sped up like 2,000 times. Everything looks like it's really quick. But these can actually take many hours. And I do like to just take my time with them. Let me see, one of the reasons why I do a background like this is because if I'm getting in all these tight areas and I miss something, like I miss putting paint somewhere, at least I have sort of the general color of the painting behind those strokes. So we don't really see it at all. And then anything that's sort of left visible will help just unify the entire piece. I usually paint on, for my landscape pieces, sort of a pinkish orange color. And I find that ground actually does a lot of the heavy lifting for me. And then your colors, it's really interesting to watch color mix on those surfaces because color is so relative. And so when I was putting these sort of grays on this green, because this is so green, these looked really kind of almost dead. They were just like really flat gray, but now with everything else coming back in here, it's starting to be a little bit more interesting. So you're constantly also like having to remember what you're seeing on a surface isn't necessarily how it's going to appear at the end, because it's going to start reacting with all of the other colors around it. I actually find painting on wood panel easier on smaller pieces also, because I find on small pieces on canvas, the canvas sort of appears almost like a pixel. It's almost like there's like a resolution to it. So with wood panel, because the texture is so much smoother, you don't get that kind of pixel effect. So I do think this is something that I'm going to be doing more often with my small pieces. I feel like they just read better. And I'm going to have to mix up a bit more paint. I don't want to add too much black to this because it'll warm it too far. But I also just want to desaturate my mix a little bit, and these phthalo with yellow are intense. So I need just enough to desaturate my color without warming it too much. I could add a bit of warmth in there. Kind of golden, maybe brown it out a little bit. Add a bit of orange in there to knock some of those intensities out. Again, not enough to warm the color, just enough to desaturate it. Make it a little bit more brownish in tone. I think that's a bit better for my shadow. colors tend to warm also as they come forward, so. And like I said, I will put the glaze over this at the end. But I'll have to wait for it to dry first. So with oil paint, it's fun because you can really go dark to light, light to dark, dark to light, light to dark, and keep building. And generally, I like to create my shapes and as much as possible work dark to light first. So I'm going to lay in sort of some darker areas and then go back in and do some lighter details. And create some sort of rock shapes down and around here. Thanks for joining, guys. If anyone has any questions, let me know. I get kind of quiet when I paint. It's really meditative. Just trying to work out this wake right now. I'm not convinced of my color down here yet, but I know I can change it with some glazes. I'll basically just mix up some of that glazing medium. The blending and glazing one from Winsor Newton here. And go over this whole area, likely with my phthalo blue at the end. So I want to kind of get some colors and texture down. And after I do that, I can go back over the top. This is pretty rough right now, but I know I can sort of fix it up later. I do want to create some dark colors that are different from the whale too. This is the other thing that I'm kind of doing right now. The whale, I'm going to use pretty much straight black in the really darks, but then I'm going to go and add some ultramarine blue and some phthalo blue. But I'll use more ultramarine because there's more phthalo in the water. And if I add too much phthalo to those highlight blues, they're going to get lost. So I can create a temperature contrast. It'll still read as blue, but I need to create a temperature contrast to sort of help them stand out against all of the other blues in the painting. And that's sort of one thing, or the type of thing that I do during planning, sort of in my head when I'm working through paintings. This got too dark. I'm going to add some white to it. I'll kind of just lighten this up a little bit. The fun thing about oil is you can go dark and then layer light details over top. And because it's still wet, you can get soft blends and things. With acrylic, it's a little bit harder. You have to work a little bit harder on those things. I can also just kind of smear direction lines. So like, if I want this to look like it's kind of fuzzed out, I can just do this over the top, and it will kind of fuzz those lines for me. So they'll look like they're a little bit more in motion. I'm going to be careful. I'm adding texture here, but if it's not the main part of this story, I need to be careful with it. I can't put too much detail in areas that are not my focal point because they'll attract too much attention. But I also don't want this to be blank. So I'm just going to sort of stipple in some visual interest and then kind of soften it back out again. And then again, when I put a glaze over this, these little marks are going to change color and they're going to be kind of like a brighter blue-green. And essentially what I'm doing right now with the white is just adding value detail. I love looking through water when I'm going over it. One of my favorite places is in Australia. We take the ferry to this place called Rottnest Island. And the water's really shallow. And even though we're moving really quickly, I can see all of the big rock masses and seagrass masses sort of flying by under the boat. I love it. So this is partly what I wanted to capture with these ones. That sort of above, below water feeling. So with water, you kind of want to paint what's under the water first and then what's on top of the water. So I kind of put some rocks underneath here, and now I'm just going over with some white and just adding some sort of ripples that are interrupting these shapes that I just created. So they pass over top, and my light's probably kind of blocking out. There's a lot of glare. Maybe that's better. You see it a little bit better. I don't see it as well. It's always tricky filming. I'm gonna go for some dark in here. Grab some shapes. All right, I think I'm just gonna go straight in here. Start this little whale. Okay, so that was flat black on the top here. Let's see, at the top of it, I think I'm going to do nice and black. But I'm going to add some ultramarine blue in there, which is a more purple blue than what I've been using. And I'm going to do sort of a transition color in here. And then add some white in there. And again, if the colors are not strong enough, or the saturation isn't strong enough, because when you add white to oil paint, it really desaturates colors. But you can get around that by glazing. So if I add white to this, you'll see I have to add a lot more blue. It gives me a blue, but it's sort of desaturated. So if I go over this with a glaze after, with just like straight ultramarine when it's dry, I'm going to be able to pick that saturation back up and just basically be working over a value. And you don't even have to glaze with like a straight color. You can do subtle gradients, and it's a lot of fun. So I might even add some of the phthalo in there on some parts of it. So yeah, hey everyone who's watching me paint this little whale. I'm quite silent at times, I'm sorry, but if you guys have any questions, do feel free to ask away. I'm painting this little guy in Winsor Newton oil paint with very little additives on a wood panel that has been toned with just some acrylic paint, phthalo blue, black, and gesso. It establishes my base color. And so any gaps that I miss in painting, we're not really bothered by because we don't see them. And I'm gonna add a little bit more ultramarine to this. Darker. It's too, value is too high. Here we go. So yeah, I'm using the ultramarine mix instead of the phthalo mix for parts of the whale so that it stands out against all of my other greens and blues. Greens, blues, and blacks, in fact. So this is the little fin under the water here. But I will also glaze that down when I go over it to push it back under the water. It just takes a while. These paintings just take quite a while. I always wish they could go fast, but it's just not the name of the game with art. And I'm gonna sort of, let me see, this body kind of comes back this way, and then I want the water to kind of break up what we're seeing because it distorts. The paint's getting a bit sticky, so I'm just going to add a little bit of oil. Oil paint is a bit stickier than acrylic. I like to use the edge of my flat brushes. I don't often use rounds. I use them on the little things up here, just on the silhouettes, but for the most part, I like painting with flats. usually what I do after I'm done all of this stuff is I take wherever I've painted sort of the ridges or the high points of my waves back here that would be facing the island, and I'll paint the sort of island colors on this side of my waves. Kind of helps to anchor them next to the water and the land. And then we've got a bit of distortion on that fin. I can just describe things. Sometimes I don't have to show everything necessarily. I find it actually a lot harder painting this small than painting large. It's harder to get your whole body into the brush stroke, and I find I just do better work when I'm working larger because of that. But as I mentioned, this is going to be advantageous for other reasons. And sometimes people want to buy a painting, but they don't want a massive painting. There's just not always space for it. So it's nice to offer these smaller pieces. So this little dabbing technique that I'm doing now, it's something from drawing. It's called stippling, and it's where you just kind of like touch your brush to the surface or your pencil, and then you make marks that way, like tiny little marks. It's a really handy technique for random texture in oil paint. In acrylic, you can use it to do some sort of soft blending. Okay, maybe back to this whale. Wrong color. There we go. Get some of these darks in here. I'm gonna have to do the overlapping after, because like some of the water comes up over the body here. So I've sort of marked some in, but I can come back over later and do some more sort of detail work on that with a finer brush. That's where I'll bring out my round brush. And I want to kind of detail things. Ooh, another thing to think about, that could be really helpful. I'm going to have this lighter edge of water here. So if I do a little rim of dark, I can do like dark, light hierarchy in this painting. And it helps the shapes to read. If I did something that was light or a similar value, I would just sort of lose those edges, which obviously we don't want to lose our forms. And again, that's where color temperature can help. By changing to an ultramarine blue, even if it's a similar value, I'll be able to sort of show where the whale stops and the water starts. these are really shiny. So I need to sort of be able to get some of the reflections off the surroundings. All right, so there's the white parts of the whale that I need to deal with now. So I'm just going to take sort of a white mix and use the colors that are in my brush, which is basically like a bit of ultramarine blue, black, and white, and phthalo blue. So this is going to read a little bit warmer because more black is coming through. Sometimes just adding black to a color can warm the temperature enough so you don't have to add anything else to it. It's just like in relation to the other very cool colors, it looks quite warm. And this is such a good color combination for the very rainy West Coast. It's always kind of gray days. And kind of soften this out. I'm going to paint an eye in there subtly, but I need a smaller brush for that. So. Getting there. He's starting to look like a whale now. It takes a while. I'm going to grab my other little brush and work that eye. Just a little hint. Slowly getting there. Sometimes paintings don't look like anything until all of a sudden they start looking like something. Just takes time. I just have to kind of trust the process and trust that some hours will put it all together. There are some paintings though that I continue for like too long, and then I realize I should have stopped way before because they're not really going anywhere. It happens less though with experience. I still do failed paintings especially when I start experimenting, but I do less now than I used to. It's a little bit more encouraging. There we go. We've got one whale looking not too bad, actually. Getting fairly happy with this little guy. I can always come back in later with this fine little brush and add a few more details and sharpen some lines and soften some other ones. Add a little bit more value contrast in some things. I know that I need a little highlight up in here. Sometimes this is easier when it's dry. I have to fix those lines a bit. They're not really happening how I want them to, but that's all right. Okay, so I'll go over here. Since I have white on my brush already, I might as well use it. So I've got sort of this little area here as the white of this whale. That's too dark, but that's okay. I can add a bit more white. And then I'll just sort of blend it out on, it's not really canvas, on the panel. And the blacks, which are in here. Switching back to my bigger brush. And adding my ultramarine blue back in. Give myself that little transition band of color here. And I'll need a bit of white. Just trying to lay out my first pass of painting. Sometimes I'm really lucky and I only have to do it once. I do try to get it all done in one sitting if I can, but sometimes I go back and just glaze a few little things just to push and pull shadows or saturation. Add a couple extra highlights with just some white and then push it back into the proper color family, just with a little glaze over top. I'm gonna have to bring the water up over this part of the whale after. So I'm doing a little bit of break in color here. And then I'll sort of bridge those differences afterwards so it's a little bit more natural looking. Whale number 2 is taking shape. This is actually coming together fairly quickly. I'm going to switch to a smaller brush. I also have so I've got this tiny little number 4 Zen. These are super cheap. They're like $5 brushes, but they're awesome. I love them for oil and acrylic. And then I've got a Noble brush. I love these also. And this is just a really tiny round. It's like 20 0. I don't know what that means, but 20 over 0. And then this one is also a Zen, but it's a 1/4 8th flat or angle brush, 8mm. And I really like this one to get in for some fine detail stuff. And again, this straight black out of the tube is going to read fairly easily in terms of value and temperature next to the green just behind it. And thanks again, guys, for joining in. Really happy that you're here. Feel free to ask any questions. I'm doing this one in Winsor Newton oil paint. I'm not really adding anything to it. I'm fairly purist when it comes to my oil painting. And I'm doing it on a wood panel that has been pre-prepped with some gesso and acrylic paint. And my mix is phthalo blue, Mars black, and gesso, in fact, which is pretty much like a titanium white. And I did sand it a little bit to make it smooth. I sometimes find I get better control with these little flat brushes than I do with round brushes. I can use the edge, but the bristles sort of behave a little bit better. Got a little bit too much paint on the brush there, so I removed some. Some of this I'll go back and do another little pass after it's dry, just to clean up some of these little edges here. It's a tiny little space. I don't know if you guys can hear my dog snoring in the background. She's having a good snore. It's quite cute. We took her for a play to the park today. She's actually going blind slowly. It's really sad. She got cataracts, and then we gave her surgery, hoping we could restore her vision because she was basically blind in that eye already. And then cataracts can also cause glaucoma issues if you leave them. But she reacted badly to the surgery. No fault of the surgeon. It's just one of the complications that can happen. And so she's blind in that eye now. We're managing it. We may have to remove it, unfortunately, if it doesn't stay controlled with medication. It can be quite painful for them when they have pressure spikes. So I'm doing what I can to keep her very comfortable. But yeah, we took her to the park, and honestly, you would never know that she's blind in that eye because She was catching her ball like crazy, having the best old time ever. So it's at least not like affecting her too much. It's kind of sad to think about though. It's totally the wrong color, but I'm just gonna go over it with some black and it's gonna hide it. There we go. This part's a little bit tricky because his nose is going under the water here. And I need to make that read, so I'm probably going to have to go back over this when it's dry with a very tiny brush and just create some sort of splashes. I put some dark around it for now, and then I'm going to go back over it with light, so then I have some contrast for that to sit on top of. So I'm just working on this little oil painting in Winsor Newton Oils of Orca off the coast of BC. They always swim up to the docks and things in the fall. It's really awesome to see. I'm like mesmerized by orca and completely terrified at the same time. They're such impressive animals. I think I always go to Australia to go snorkeling, and while I'm afraid to come across a shark, I sometimes wonder, would I prefer to come across a shark in the wild or a pod of orca? And I think I'm tending toward the shark, but of course, depending on the species. I don't know. That's a tough call. They're beautiful and terrifying. Very skilled hunters. And I think at this point, quite annoyed at humans. And some of those boat attacks. They like to gang up. They're definitely a gang up species. All right, I'm going to switch back to my bigger brush and see if I can just fill in the rest of this without cutting too badly. So I'll like basically consider this first pass finished after I fill in all of these areas that are just still aground. And then I'll go back over and add a little bit of detail and things in the trees. I don't want to over detail them. They're not the focal point. And then I'll definitely like sort of wait till this dries and then go over with some of this blending glazing medium and just kind of like clean up some edges and refine some of my values on there to make sure they read. And then I will add a few glazes to sort of drop this back. Right now it's really green and it's not looking awesome. I want to bring it more into the color of here, but I really want this to look like it's under the water. So by sort of bringing the value up a little bit first and changing it to a little bit more green already, when I glaze over with these tones, it'll push them back and give sort of a uniform look to it as though we're peering through water. It's kind of a fun technique. And I do that all the time in acrylic too for my rocks underwater. So you want to paint sort of what's under the water first and then paint the water over top. It's just kind of like this. These rock shelves under the water here. Often also covered in seagrasses, but I won't do the seagrasses in this one. I don't want to cause too much visual noise against these whales on the surface. And so I'm using ivory black and phthalo blue, a little bit of, so just in my palette over here. So ivory black, phthalo blue, ultramarine blue, cadmium red, cadmium yellow, white, and yellow ochre is my palette for this one, staying quite cool in color into the green tones. Well, I guess the canvas is fully covered. So I'm, I guess, call this done for today. I need to let it dry. And then I can finish the rest of it. I've got a bunch of cleanup to do. I mean, it's pretty good. I've got some stuff going on here. I don't know. I want to do some more, like, maybe with a small brush, like, see, I'll grab some white and then some of this color with some yellow. Some little rock details on the bottom. So I'll end up just kind of, so I can't go too intense here. And desaturated a bit with black, but I want to come in and just like maybe add just some sort of rock noise. It's like there's something happening under here. Some like streaks from the water. And then I will also do the same with like some blacks maybe, just to add some darker parts. So I'll sort of work between the two. I don't want to over texture this stuff. It is around the head of this main orca, so I do want to concentrate it here. One of the ways that you can draw attention to your focal point is by adding more detail, but I don't want the rocks on the bottom to be the focal point. So I'm basically gonna sort of add this detail in now and then cover it up with glazes. So it'll drop it back, and I'm gonna glaze in the phthalo blue that I've been using, and it'll kind of tint all of these little marks to be sort of the same greeny, deep greeny blue tone, and it'll help drop it back. So I'll take some black here, and this just kind of like gives me a bit of detail to draw the attention up here, but I do want it to be soft enough that when I sort of go back over the whales with a bit more detail and some glazes, that they're going to pop. And I want to tighten up these little water shapes, and then also have the water kind of coming across their bodies that are underwater. Just to break up those shapes so we can tell that they're gliding through it. And I can go in and, yeah, just add some tighten up some of my lines, add a little bit more contrast, a little bit more shape definition. And then I'm going to work on another day. I somehow lost my little canvas. That's impressive. I don't know how I do that. Here it is, at my feet. So I'm going to work another day on this little one, which you may or may not be able to see. It's more underwater with the trees up here, and then there's like, we're under the water looking through. Instead of being above and looking through to the whales, we're taking their point of view and being under the water and looking up. So that'll be the next one. Anyways, thanks for everyone who joined in and watched this sort of come together. You can, yeah, they will be available on my website. Probably in just a couple of weeks. So if you want to check in, anyone that's on my website gets first dibs to all of my originals. These are small on purpose. I want to be able to turn them into prints. So yeah, thanks for tuning in, everyone who tuned in, and I hope to see you again in the studio soon. Bye.